Hey folks, Matt Easton here again. So I'm still in Petworth Park in West Sussex, and I'm answering questions that I put up on the Scholar Facebook page, link below if you're not already on that page. And for a spontaneous off-the-cuff, I thought I'll quickly film some videos in a park, and or maybe I'll ask if you've got any questions. There are some absolutely sterling questions here, and I haven't read them all yet. I'm just literally working my way down. But there are some great ones here. Apologies if I don't get around to answering yours. I can't answer all of them, obviously, because I'd be here for about the next 3 days, given the amount of time I talk about one thing. So Patrick M. Bondurant, I think the surname said, says, excellent question. When it comes to rapiers, do swept hilt rapiers with the Pappenheimer style plate inside offer both the protection against cuts that a swept hilt normally offers, with the thrust protection to the hand of a cup hilt? Yes, the basic answer is yes. So for anyone who doesn't know, a Pappenheimer rapier is essentially like a swept hilt. It's a development of the swept hilt whereby the two sides have been filled with a plate that creates essentially like a double shell guard. And yes, absolutely, they are very strong hilts against cuts, and obviously you've filled in the big gaps between the bars in such a way that they offer better protection against thrusts as well. So the basic answer is yes, but everything comes at a cost, okay? And in my experience, Pappenheimers can be quite heavy hilts, okay? So you've got to bear in mind that the more stuff you add to the hilt of a rapier, you might be adding to the hand protection. Apologies for my phone buzzing there. You might be adding to the hand protection, but you're adding to the weight of the weapon potentially, and you're making it handle worse, you're making it slower, this kind of stuff. So it's always a trade-off, isn't it? Cup hilts, I have to say, cup hilts are pretty damn good protection against most things, against cuts and thrusts. Arguably, because they've just got a knuckle bow in front and they don't have any sidebars, arguably they are less protection against certain types of cuts than a swept hilt, but still cupped hilts are, I mean, there's a reason why cup hilts are favoured very much in the modern HEMA competition scene, so much so that I have been known to whinge about the fact that people who are practising rapier sources that aren't supposed to be using cup hilts, when they use cup hilts in competition, it feels a bit cheap to me. I won't say it's cheating, because it's not cheating, because a person of that period could have gone and got a cup hilt, at least unless it's before cup hilts came along. But fundamentally, I feel like it's undermining your source slightly if you're not using the same weapon as your source should. But anyway, I know different people have got different views on that. Anyway, let's have a look at another question on here as well. So looking down the list of questions here, there's one from Valerie Widowson, who is one of my own students and I know very well. So hi Valerie, I've got to answer your question given that you've asked one, although I have to say it's not a very easy question to answer. So the question that Valerie asks is, when learning a source alone, what is the best way to go through a paired technique? Ooh. Do you start off with learning the attack or the defense? Well, I don't know. The basic answer is it's very difficult to learn a paired technique if you're alone. There are things you could rig up, that you could set up a dummy with a sword sticking out of it. We know this was done historically, certainly in the 19th century, and probably done before. I mean, we know there were things like the quintain and other pels and other training implements, a bit like the wooden dummy that is used in Chinese Kung Fu. So off the cuff, because I haven't thought a lot about this, off the cuff, my inclination, if you don't have some kind of device to practice with, would be it doesn't really matter whether you start with the attack or the defense. I would suggest that because the defense is responsive and the attack is usually the initial action, you can't defend unless there's an attack coming in, start with the attack. Okay, so first of all practice the attack going through, and then practice the corresponding defense, but you're never going to be able to fit those two things together really without a training partner. So the most important thing, if you really want to drill a complete technique, is to have someone else to train with. But I fully understand there are lots of people out there for whom that's just not practical, either because you can't get to a club or you just don't know anybody else who's interested, this kind of stuff. So incidentally, the first step is to find someone else who will train with you. But anyway, assuming that's not possible. So yeah, drill the attack, drill all the attacks, I would say. And then as a defender, you pretty much just have to imagine the attack coming in. And you know, I've done this myself in the past, in terms of, you know, when I was younger, before HEMA existed, or before I knew it existed, when I was in my teens, and I'd got someone to make me a longsword, and I was just practicing movements. I was thinking, okay, if an attack came in like this, what are my options? And you can practice the different defensive things, practice the footwork, practice the blade, but you have to do a lot of it with imagination, because a lot of it's about blade engagements. So you have to, in your mind, be aware of quite a lot of information, like the fact that you might be wanting to catch the opponent's blade on the medium of your blade or on the strong of your blade. You need to know about strong, medium and weak. And then you can get an inanimate object and push against it to get that feeling. So in your mind, you know what that might feel like. So basically, it's very difficult, but you can fill in the gaps to some extent if you don't have access to another training partner. Practice the attack first. Attacks, for the most part, are fairly simple. What's a little bit more complex, and you can practice more by yourself, are combination attacks. So stringing sets of attacks together, or feint attacks. So practice feint and attack to one place, then same feint and attack to a different place, or a different feint and the same attack, and try and work through these combos. So there's definitely different solo drills you can do for attacking and defending as well, but practicing defending by yourself is more difficult, but you can do it absolutely, just using the positions and imagining the attacks coming in and filling in the gaps to do with the strong and weak blade engagements and things like this, the resistance, filling in those gaps with your brain, imagining it basically. I hope that helps a bit. Let's have a look at another question. So this is a really great question from Ian McFarland, and he asks, but I should say before I start this, I'm gonna give a simple answer to this, because this could be a series of videos all by itself. It's a huge, potentially huge question. Ian says, you've talked about what materials a modern sword might be made of. So a sword in the modern world, or even futuristic world. And my answer is steel, no surprise. Yeah, basically steel's still the best material to make a sword out of. But what about modern armour? What might that look like? Well, we kind of know, don't we? We kind of know what modern armours... So modern armours have to be able to stand up to ballistics, explosions. So essentially it's going to have to be ceramic of some kind, isn't it? So I think what you start off with doing is you look at what's modern tank armour made of, but then you have to bear in mind that a human has to be able to sustain the weight of the armour. But then you think, hold on, Warhammer 40k, and then you think, oh, hold on, they're building these things even for soldiers right now, which will enable them to lift heavy weights and walk around, you know, be hugely strong and jump high and stuff like this. So I think what we're going to talk about is if you want to make a modern armour, or should we say a slightly futuristic, like in the next 10 years armour, that would absolutely be rifle proof. I mean, you could make rifle proof armour, I think, right now, without too much effort. It would make standard soldiers without being powered up with servo motors and stuff. It would make them probably quite slow and not very effective soldiers on the battlefield, but nevertheless, I think if you could basically make the equivalent of a space marine from Warhammer 40k. So I think that's what you do, isn't it? The first thing would be you'd need a sort of exoskeleton on the person's body that adds servo motors to all of their limbs and core and neck and things like this, so that they're super strong. Once they're super strong, then you can slap a load of armour on them, and that armour is probably going to be related to modern tank armour. So it's going to be ceramic, it's going to be, some of it might be reactive armour, some of it, I don't know, maybe it wouldn't, because you wouldn't necessarily want to pepper someone with machine gun fire and have all their armour kind of fall apart. I don't know. but also remember that the servos, the motors that you'd stick on their exoskeleton, which would be under the armour, would make them faster, not just stronger. It could mean that they could jump high, they could run fast, they could lift super weights, and of course they could carry the armour that they were wearing. So I actually think that Warhammer got it more or less right. I think that what you'd end up is something like a Space Marine. And of course, remember, they'd absolutely have to have a helmet on, and the helmet could have all sorts of audio and visual enhancement. We've only got 2 eyes. Our eyes work pretty well, but you could have a 360-degree vision thing, probably mounted on the top of the head, which could be giving you a sort of CinemaScope vision all the way around, so you could see behind you and in front of you. So yeah, so we're getting into sort of practically robot soldiers, aren't we? And you could say at that point, well, is there any point having a human inside this thing? Why not just make it into a robot? I actually think that probably, much like with aeroplanes today, you can make an unmanned air if there are lots of them in use in combat, but you know, manned aeroplanes are still probably the most effective interceptors and fighters, because a human inside is still able to make human decisions better than computers can at the moment. But we'll see. I mean, maybe you'd have a mixed infantry force of people, some people in these powered up suits, plus some robots. So you'd perhaps have a human officer and then squaddies made of squaddy computer robot squaddies, basically. Something like that. Anyway, there's my idea. I think the first thing you need is the powered up exoskeleton, and then you can basically slap tons of armour on top of that. Right, let's have a look at one more question before I sign off. So here's an interesting question. It's the kind of question that I would have come up with myself, but which I don't think I've ever addressed on video. And it's from Sydney Landoli Jr. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. And Sydney says, is there any chance for a Sabre to be effective against full plate armour? Well, this is an interesting question for a number of points, not just my Mad Max Crimean War scenario, but also because it did sort of happen. Okay, so if we look at the Turks invading parts of Europe, or conquering parts of Europe in the 16th century, or indeed if we go all the way, you know, you could go to some areas of conflict on the edges of what we'd now call Europe, between groups of people, some groups of people who were using sabres and others who were wearing plate armour in the 15th century and 16th century. So it did happen. And equally, if we go to the 17th century, we know that, for example, Polish hussars wore plate armour, not full plate armour, wore plate armour, and some of their opponents did. Some of them had plate armour still, and they were using sabres as well as other consoeurs and, you know, the S-stock and other sorts of weapons as well. So sabres did encounter plate armour, and it's a good question, because, you know, you look at the Siege of Malta, for example, in the 1560s, I think, wasn't it? The Siege of Malta, it must have been the case that some of the commanders at the Siege of Malta were wearing pretty much full plate, and some of their opponents would have been using yataghans and kilits, which are essentially sabres. So the question is, are any swords really effective against plate armour? And I guess that's kind of my answer, is a sabre, can a sabre be effective against plate armour as much as an arming sword can, as much as a Langmesser can? I mean, there's nothing really that an arming sword or a Langmesser does that a sabre can't do. They both cut, they both thrust, they're both one-handed, they both weigh about the same, about 2 pounds. So, you know, the question is really, how do you overcome someone in plate armour? And that's actually the greater underlying question. And the answer is, well, it's difficult. People, you know, plate armour was extremely effective, but you've got to remember there's still a human inside. And, you know, everybody knows, I think, hopefully by now, that it's about bypassing the plate armour. If you've got a sword or a pointy object anyway, it's about bypassing the plate armour and getting in a gap. But additionally, there are some weapons you can just bash the person in armour. A poleaxe, a warhammer, a mace, a gun. If you just hit that person really hard, then sometimes that will kill them or very badly injure them inside the armour anyway. So, you know, Fiore makes reference to hitting the opponent in the helmet 3 times with the poleaxe or adza, and that might fell them. And he says if it doesn't, then you drop your axe and you grab them by the visor and you pull them to the floor. You wrestle. So wrestling is the other way. So All of these things are available to you if your primary weapon is a sabre, or even your secondary weapon is a sabre. You can hit them with something else, or you can stab them in a gap, or you can wrestle with them, or you can wrestle with them while trying to stab them, or you can wrestle with them and pull out a knife or dagger and stick that in, and then pick up your sabre again to fight the other people who don't have plate armour. These are all answers to the question, but fundamentally one-handed swords aren't very effective against plate armour. That's the overall answer. But your primary goal with a one-handed sword against someone in plate armour, if there are no other weapons available, is going to be stabbing in a gap and probably wrestling with them, and maybe doing those two things at the same time. So there we go. There is one final option open to you, which is shown in Paulus Cal's treatise from about 1460, I think. I can't remember the exact date. And on that, they're wrestling on the floor, but he uses the rondel dagger to cut one of the, I think, the points holding the pauldron, if I remember correctly, to the person's armour lying on the floor, and then pulls the pauldron off and then can stab them with abandon in the shoulder, presumably, or, you know, into the lungs. So that's another option available to you, is to use the sabre to cut something that's keeping the armour together. And for that reason, if we look at cuirasses from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, they've got these straps which come over the shoulder, which hold the backplate to the breastplate, and those straps have usually got chains or plates on them to protect them from being cut, which is evidence by itself that that was sometimes done prior to those plates and chains being added. So there we go, that's kind of an answer. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there, and I'm going to have a look and see if there's some more questions here for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.